This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Natural Grower. Launched in 2019, their award-winning liquid fertiliser and plant feed and soil conditioner is made entirely from maize. Naturally rich in nitrogen, potash, phosphate and other trace elements that plants and vegetables love, it's approved by the Soil Association, Vegan Society and organic farmers and growers. Their concentrated natural fertiliser can be poured around the base of plants, whilst the plant feed and soil conditioner can be mixed into the soil or compost and used as a mulch on the surface as a long-term, slow-release fertiliser. The fertiliser can be used for all outdoor and indoor plants, and as a special offer for listeners, Natural Grower are offering 15% off all their range. Go to naturalgrower.co.uk and enter Roots15 on checkout. So this week's guest is forest gardener Anni Kelsey. Anni is an experienced grower of edibles and she follows the principles of forest gardening, if you're not sure what that means, all will be revealed. Her latest book, The Garden of Equal Delight, sets out principles for managing a garden in order to maximise its productive yield, but it's much more than that. It's about gardening sustainably and using techniques that many conventional gardeners might find unusual, but which work. So to start, what is a forest garden?
Okay, so I'll give you a short answer and then a longer answer. Short answer is that it's an edible ecosystem that's based on perennial plants. So that captures the essence of it. And then I've got a longer one, which is a couple of sentences that I formulated mainly to put in my book. So I'll just read that out if that's okay. So a forest garden is both a planned landscape and a functioning ecosystem that takes its composition, form and structure from a natural woodland. It's a naturalistic landscape, but not an entirely natural or wild one. Humans are an integral part of the forest garden, but they must accept and learn their own place within the ecosystem. So that's just sort of fleshing out the idea of an edible ecosystem. But having said that, I first came upon the concept as just stated in the longer explanation of it being a foresty, woody kind of landscape, essentially. But actually, the same ideas do translate into other kinds of ecosystems. So it could be a grassland savanna or an aquatic ecosystem or a marginal one between a boggy and a dry landscape or a desert one or whatever, if you live in such an area or have knowledge of it. But the original concept came from the idea that in a wooded rather than a forested landscape, that you have different layers of vegetation, from tall trees to medium ones to large shrubby plants, thorny ones that might grow in hedges, and then the slightly lower herbaceous plants, and then the smaller ground covers, all sort of intermingled with climbers in a wild landscape like wild rose and honeysuckle, and dug into from below with the root systems of different plants. So the idea being that something that is as multi-layered as that is able to catch and then use a lot of sunlight, the maximum potentially amount of sunlight of a landscape, and then convert that into growth. So I believe it's understood that such ecosystems do generate more biomass than many other ecosystems, and therefore that it's an efficient way of using the sun's energy.
Yes. I mean, I think that's where I get confused personally, because I think of a forest as a kind of upper story of trees and then a relatively denuded kind of a lower level.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they often are, especially like the reforestation that we've got all over the UK going back to the 20th century, where lots of coniferous woodland was planted. They are pretty much monocultures and nothing underneath. So yes, the idea came from something that was adapted from other ideas, and it's come into being as something that can give you slightly a misperception of it, but you can't really rename it now, I don't think. But I don't know if Jake Rayson, who does the Forest Garden Wales website, he's the one that sort of gives this very concise, it's an edible ecosystem. And he, I think, usually adds in with lots of native plants. But I think that gives you, in a nutshell, what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Jake has actually been on the podcast.
Oh, has he?
Very good friend of the podcast and of mine. So, I'm glad to hear he's coined that. Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I think sometimes it throws people off the scent. But moving on to the book, what I thought was really fascinating, and you encapsulated everything I think about gardening and how I try and communicate about it. But you wrote in the book that you wondered how you would describe or explain what you do in the garden to someone else. And I think the way that you garden is very intuitive and it's very site specific. And this style of gardening that you practice can mean that it's hard to replicate it and to explain it. So how did you overcome that before you started writing the book?
I spent a lot of time thinking, a lot of time watching myself in the garden. When I got the idea that was what I hoped to do, because it felt that it was very intuitive and it felt that it was working, but I really didn't understand why, not in as much detail as I certainly do now. So I'd find myself looking at the garden, interacting with it, and I'm thinking, why am I taking that plant out? Why am I leaving it? Why am I doing that? And over time, as I thought about it, and it was quite a long time, various ideas started to sort of crystallize, and I scribbled them down and worked on them, and eventually they came out as what I've called the principles of forest gardening, which I've tried to write and explain in a way that hopefully would be able to be a bit like a friend holding anybody's hand as they would experimenting or experiencing a different way of doing things. I've used examples from my own garden as a way of getting into the reasoning behind what I've said, but I hope that other people would be able to reasonably readily translate them into other contexts, because a lot of it actually hinges on doing very little and watching a great deal. And I think the more anybody does that in the bigger world outside the natural world, the more you start to understand and can then, in a more, call it intelligent way, a more informed way, learn to interact.
I was just thinking, sorry, my brain was going overtime then. I mean, it's kind of like I almost want to resist making rules because I think that then things can become prescriptive, and
Yes,
I also don't
yes.
like rules personally. So it's a kind of fine line, isn't it, to tread, to actually give principles, but actually then to say, these are kind of, I'm handing these to you, you go away and make them work for you in your space.
Yeah.
But I do think you do a really good job of communicating that.
Thank you. It wasn't easy, I have to say. I had many, many drafts, lots and lots of scribbling, and a huge amount of thought went into trying to make it logical. So I'm glad it seems to have worked.
Yeah, it does. It's very clever. So getting a bit more into the sort of nitty gritty of it, there are some things that you do in your garden that I think some people might find perfectly normal, whilst other gardeners might, kind of go, oh, that's unusual. So I thought we could talk about, first off, the practice of bringing nothing in and taking nothing out of the garden, because although that seems like it could be fairly straightforward, actually, when you put it into practice, I suspect it's a little bit more difficult. How have you found that?
To me, it's just become perfectly natural. But how it started was that with the garden I used to have, which was in another part of Shropshire where we were living when I first began this gardening journey, I was really keen to see at first how much edible stuff I could get out of the garden for putting the minimum amount of energy or other resources in. I wanted to know what that little patch could do on its own, sort of extrapolating to an extreme situation, say where you couldn't transport food anywhere, you had to have what was some future scenario, whatever. You had to have what was really close by and you didn't have other resources. I just wanted to push that idea to the limit, really. So I hadn't grown food in that garden before, although there were fruit trees in it. And I used what was generated within the garden to rot down and then generate fertility for the garden. But previously what I had done would actually remove the potential fertility by taking it to the local authority recycling centre. So when I'd filled the compost bin that I did use then with stuff and had no more room to put it, it would all go in the back of the car, and I'd drive around the road and throw handfuls of green stuff into the skip or whatever. So I stopped doing that, and I actually found that by mostly leaving it on the ground pretty close to where it had been cut from or pulled from, that the garden seemed to get a boost of fertility anyway. It was kind of doing its composting in situ, and I hadn't removed that potential fertility off site.
And that kind of leads me very nicely on to the next question that I had, which was how you bring uncultivated areas into production. And I found that fascinating. And even for me, I'm a big fan of kind of losing stuff in the garden that I might weed and I might prune, and I might then lose that stuff somewhere else in the garden.
Yeah.
But I found that quite sort of unusual, the way that you bring the areas into production. Can you just talk about that?
Yes, yeah. With the garden that I've got now in Wales, when we first bought that property, it was entirely lawned with just 2 or 3 like specimen shrubs that the previous people had planted. So the first year I'd brought plants, as you do, from the previous garden and needed somewhere to put them. And I made a small area for a patch to plant them into, a mixed polyculture patch. And rather than even digging into the lawn, I pulled a load of scrappy materials out of the hedge. A lot of, when in the country, when they use the farmers flail the hedgerows and you get all this sort of leaf stuff that falls down. Well, over the years, a big layer of dusty, dry, leafy stuff, it wasn't even quite moulded, accumulated. So I scraped that out from the bottom of the hedge, and ivy and stuff. And I put that on the ground and just planted into it and mulched it with lawn cuttings as we cut the lawn over the summer. And it was basically just using whatever was there. I didn't know if things would grow in it, but they did. And then the next year I needed to expand the growing area, and I from one strip alongside a path, dug up a load of turf from the lawn, so just exposing it, and planted just directly into that without digging it or anything. And it was very grey and dull and not very full of life at all, as you might expect. And the turf I'd taken from that, I took to the other side of the garden, turned upside down, in making quite a heap of it, maybe like a foot high. With whatever area of that much covered, and planted into the top of that. And then both of those were mulched with the grass cuttings from the lawn and other bits and pieces that arose through the summer. But in those days, there was more lawn than anything else, so there was more of that. Whereas the neighbours, they all have to take their grass cuttings and anything else. They've all got huge sacks, and every now and again they put them in the backs of their car and take them down to the local authority recycling place. So mine just goes directly on the garden.
And you don't compost it, you just put it on as it is?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I remember years ago being told you can't put grass cuttings down on things, it'll completely wreck the garden, and it doesn't. I mean, that's the thing that arises, even though we've got a lot less lawn now, it's the thing that arises most regularly, once a week or so, a few bucketfuls at least of grass, and I just throw them where I want them, basically, which will be to suppress something or to feed something. I haven't had any difficulty at all with any, I don't know, it doesn't go mouldy, it just disappears.
Yeah, isn't it funny? Like you say, we have been kind of taught that to do that might encourage pests, it might encourage disease, it might rob the soil of nitrogen. But I do think people are coming around to that idea that actually you can just put it straight where you want it to work.
I think one of the things I've tried to do all along is to be to ask provocative questions of the garden, if you like, and to try and push things. If somebody says you can't do it, I'll try it. If somebody says don't, whatever you do, let that plant grow, I will, just to see. And sometimes I regret it, and sometimes I don't. But it's a matter of working out that relationship and the parameters of the garden. But I did used to have a compost heap in the first forest garden in Shropshire, because there we had kitchen scraps that I could put into a compost bin, and I used to shred paper and put it in as well. And before my era of forest gardening, other stuff from the garden would have gone in it. But once it was forest gardening, it was just kitchen scraps and paper. So, because I needed to do something useful with the kitchen scraps. But where we are now, the layout of our garden in respect of the neighbours round and about, it would have been really antisocial to have done that. And the local authority collects kitchen scraps in Wales, so that's kind of covered. But if they didn't, and it was a different format of garden, then I would have perhaps equally have continued to compost. I'm not against people doing any one thing or for any one thing. I think it's encouraging people to ask their own questions and try their own experiments and see what the outcome is.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of in that vein, I don't think weed. And also I was going to ask you about weeds. If I had something particularly awkward, like maybe couch grass or Japanese knotweed, what would I still not weed?
Yeah, I don't like the word weed. I prefer to call them wild plants or whatever, as they usually are, the things that just arrive. And what I do now is to try and identify anything. If I don't know what it is, to try and identify it, look it up, usually online these days, and see what interactions it has with other parts of the natural world. So maybe which butterflies or caterpillar larvae for butterflies or other insects would feed on it or benefit from it, so that I've got some understanding of what role something might fulfill in the ecosystem. And most things you do find that they are very surprisingly beneficial, food for all sorts of things. However, when you say knotweed, there are laws about knotweed, and you have to follow the rules on that. And couch grass is an interesting one. I haven't got it in this garden, but some decades ago in the 80s, I think it was, I had two different places I lived which had couch grass in, and it was like concrete spaghetti that had sort of not just moulded itself, but welded itself around the roots of some daffodils and things that were in the gardens when I inherited them. I think it depends on context, because those were really small gardens, and if I had them now, I probably would do what I endeavoured to do then, which was to take it out by hand, which is quite trying but possible for a small area, and then plant what I wanted afterwards. And if any little bits come up, not so difficult to remove it when you can spot a small bit that's grown. If it's a bigger area, then I wanted to take a sort of ecosystem forest gardening approach, then I might think about the idea of having trees and very strong growing bushes that can easily cope with a ground layer that includes grassy materials, because obviously grasses are very strong growing plants. So maybe more like an orchard kind of landscape, and see how that worked. And I can't for the life of me remember, but there's a little plant that's a semi-parasitic on grasses, isn't there? I can't remember the name of it, and they use that to create meadows. So
yellow rattle.
Right, yellow rattle. I knew it was yellow something, I just couldn't get it. Yeah, so maybe thinking of something like that could perhaps reduce the grass in a bigger area. But I think it takes a while to contemplate in any place what you've got and what the appropriate ways are to work with it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It has to be sort of site specific when you think about the response to it. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about your kind of idea of bringing the beds into commission and using maybe some debris that's come out of a hedge or grass clippings. A lot of people that I can think of immediately who are gardeners might object to that until it kind of became what it was supposed to be. And there's pictures of your garden in the book and it's beautiful. But I'm guessing for a while, you have to kind of put up with that looking, if not unattractive, then certainly kind of unconventional. So, and that makes me think maybe is the fact that, conventional gardening ways, do you think that they've got a lot to do with a lack of patience that we want these instant results?
Well, I suppose it can be, but in some circumstances, I'm thinking instant results like they do here in Shrewsbury in the park, that it's cleared of the spring bulbs and then all the summer bedding is in, and it's like the traditional municipal planting. It's amazingly attractive, but very, very ordered. And then that gets wiped out in the autumn and the next lot gets put in. And that's one way of approaching things, isn't it? Obviously, it's not the way most gardeners do at their own homes anymore. I think usually gardeners are very patient people, actually, on the whole. But what was the beginning of your question again? Sorry.
Well, just that, I mean,
yes, I think.
Yeah, I think getting those results sometimes in a more natural way takes a bit more time.
Yes, I think. I think natural means whether it's natural medicines or natural diets or to help your health or more ecosystemic gardening is a slow route to somewhere, whereas maybe adding artificial fertilizers or taking prescription medicines is a fast route to and it's a sort of it's the difference between rocket fuel and a snail, I think, in some ways, but not necessarily meaning people are lacking in patience. But I think the aesthetic thing is quite likely to be a problem, because obviously most gardeners garden because they want things to look nice, either for the joy of all the flowers and that, or more conventional vegetable gardens in the traditional rows. And that is just a very different way of doing things that works within its own terms. And I think what I do works within its own terms. But it was primarily as an experiment initially for the productivity and this whole thing about how much could I get out for how much I put in, which was very much the question I was working with to begin with. And what it looked like was completely secondary. It didn't matter in that question. As it's turned out, as nature has planted all sorts of things with other things, generally and often it looks really lovely during the summer months. And it's buzzing with all sorts of insects and bees and birds and butterflies. But there are times at which it certainly looks unconventional. And the neighbours don't hesitate to tell me, which is fun and interesting, and we can have a chat about it.
Well, I suppose it's an opportunity for education.
Yes, yeah. They understand that I do it differently, and they do say, well, I know you wouldn't do this, Annie, but what do you think of my such and such a plant? Or I've just weeded this bed and how does it look? And the neighbours both sides have got lovely gardens, and that's their way of doing it, and that's fine. I'm happy to show a way to people who are interested in doing things differently, but there's no way I want to criticise or imply any kind of criticism of people who are doing what they enjoy in the garden.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned yourself in the book that you used to garden conventionally.
Yes,
so
yeah.
Was it that attempt, that kind of experiment to find out what would maximise your yield that led you down the route of changing the way that you garden, or was it something else?
Yes, it was really, because it was finding out that there was such a thing as a forest garden. There was such a concept. I mean, at that time there weren't even very many. Martin Crawford down in Devon, who's very well known now, had been doing his for a few years, and there were very few other examples around. I'm not sure if there were any others that you could actually visit at that time, but I read about it and I was completely bowled over by the idea and just wanted to try it out. And previously, I've always loved being in the garden from a young child and planting things and growing them, but I was never very good at making it look nice. I could never learn enough about the plants that I was using, and I haven't got enough of an artistic eye to arrange them. I've got a cousin who gardens in Shropshire, not far from me, and she's very arty, and she puts these colours together and the garden looks amazing. But if I tried, it wouldn't have looked half so good in that mode of conventional gardening. I managed to do an okay job, but I think nature does a much better job now. I'm not trying so hard.
Yeah, I do wonder if there's an element of that where you give plants agency.
Yes.
And you recognise their agency and you kind of let them do a bit more what they want to do. I always say that's why I'm actually a rubbish gardener and a rubbish garden designer, because I don't like, I'm almost like a parent that's too soft. I don't like telling my plants what to do rigidly. I'll kind of let them express themselves, which isn't always conducive to the most aesthetically pleasing garden. But then that kind of makes me think about how you write about plants in the book, which is with a real sense of reverence. So why do you think that kind of all plants are special?
I think the more I interacted with plants in a different way, and the more I learned about the very different things they do in facilitating all life, really, that they're the main absorbers of the sun's energy for a start off to turn into any form of living being. And they feed all herbivores and omnivores, who then through the food chain feed the carnivores, and it all begins with the plants, if you like. I'm not sure evolutionarily which way it happened, but because I believe bacteria began first, but in the way we've got things now, plants are essentially turning inorganic carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water and hydrogen and oxygen from water and the mineral components of the soil. They're turning those inorganic elements into life, which is then feeding other life. So to me, they're the origin of all that bounty. And then when you start to learn more about the different ways they have of communicating through their roots or through phytochemicals that they can emit through their leaves, and within an ecosystem or a woodland to pass messages from tree to tree and plant to plant and coordinate how things are distributed, how water and nutrients are distributed between them, you start to think, hang on a minute, there's masses more going on here than we can get a handle on, certainly as lay people. I'm sure botanists and biologists will have a much better understanding than I do, and ecologists as well. But it starts to get mind-blowing, and then I think you start to feel much more humble and in awe of what these beings that, you can just think, oh, that's only a dandelion or that's only a daffodil or whatever, but they're all amazing. They've all got so many flowers have got the most beautiful symmetry and wonderful structure within them, and the shapes the seeds come out and the way seeds can grow from a tiny thing into a big thing. But the more I think about it, the more amazing it is. So I'm just bowled over by them.
I mean, this is a huge question, and I apologise for dropping this on you, but plants seem to have a niche. They all seem to have a function within the larger system. So where do the humans fit in? What's our function?
Yeah. Now that is a good. That is the big one. Yes, and that was my intention, really, to see what that was within the ecosystem of my garden that I'm working in. What I see it as in that context is to facilitate the development of an ecosystem Because if you're thinking about the average back garden in a place like Britain, then if it was just left to go wild, you would have a certain amount of ecosystem and things that natural creatures could make a home in brambles and nettles and docks and the things that you'd mainly see and buttercups and strong growing plants. But you wouldn't have the diversity that you can put into a more planned, and this is why I say it's a naturalistic landscape but not a natural one. So maybe using many more plants and actually supercharging it in a bit of a way by focusing intention and concentration and understanding, and then trying to maximise biomass that will feed the fertility and maximise biodiversity that will feed the health of the garden. So it's about inserting yourself in an understanding kind of way to support the growth and development of the garden, whereas what I was doing as a gardener before was being in control and saying, I want that plant there and that plant there. I think that'll look nice there. And I'll just chuck this here because I haven't got anywhere else to put it. But it was, and I don't want that growing there and I don't want that growing there. So I'll pull them up and cut them off. And it was just, completely the complete reverse of my understanding of how to be a gardener now.
If you think back to when you started gardening, how much have you changed how you do it? It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I could pinpoint why I changed the way I garden to be more sustainable and with a greater respect for biodiversity. Probably, if pushed, I'd say it was witnessing wildlife repeatedly being accidentally or deliberately harmed in the name of pretty or tidy gardens. As Annie says in her book, and I'm paraphrasing, sometimes the biggest pest in the garden is the one looking back at us in the mirror. Thanks to Annie for speaking about her book, and thank you for listening. Don't forget the special offer for listeners over at Natural Grower. They're offering 15% off all of their range, so go to naturalgrower.co.uk and enter Roots15 on checkout. I leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford, talking about what happens to bugs as the garden wakes up.
As winter gives way to spring, plants that have remained dormant for the past few months begin bursting back to life and signal the beginning of another annual cycle for the many different wildlife species that couldn't exist without plants. And as the longer, warmer days progress, our gardens become arenas for their resident and visiting wildlife to vie for mates, using inherent gestures, displays and sounds that signal both their identity and their intentions, creating a melee of visual and audible stimuli that also conceal a much more focused and specific type of signalling, one that enables secretive communication between just those that send the signals and those that can detect and decipher them. And these are chemical signals called pheromones, detectable at minuscule levels by creatures from the animal kingdom, who often deploy them to communicate over great distances. Astonishingly though, and thanks to modern-day science, we now know that it's not just the animal kingdom that uses chemical signals, but the plant kingdom too. And that plants achieve this by metabolizing volatile molecules that are released into the air as they grow. And just as the various signals from the animal kingdom are unique to different species, so are most of the volatile chemical signals from the plants. And they'll have different purposes too. Some will be produced to repel herbivores when a plant is being eaten, whilst others will attract the predators and the parasites of the herbivores. Some will even signal their plight to neighbouring plants, alerting them to switch on their own defence systems. But producing volatile chemicals is not always beneficial, since they can also be used by certain herbivores to identify their food plants. And this is the case for monophagous aphids, such as the pea, rose and cabbage aphids, who, as their names suggest, feed on just one specific type of plant. However, these delicate little herbivores are unlikely to trigger the plant's defences when they first appear, since their needle-like mouthparts usually have little effect on the plant's health as they're pushed into the leaves to suck on the sap. It's not until the infestation starts to cause harm to the plant that it'll begin metabolising those volatile chemicals to summon in the aphid's natural enemies and to alert the neighbouring plants to be prepared. And so, realising that plants already have their own defence mechanisms for controlling aphids, we can perhaps relax our efforts and ideally avoid those bug-killing pesticides that also harm the natural enemies of aphids, the predators and the parasites that the plants will be signalling to and hoping for their help.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.